Good afternoon. This is Safe and Safe Country podcast. And me, its author and host, Alina Frolova. I'll be talking to you about the security of each of us, security of the country, Europe, world. We will discuss a lot of interesting issues, how to survive within the war, what is NATO, do we want to be a part of NATO, and what politics should we develop to be a part of integrated Europe. There are many questions and we're looking for answers here. This podcast is produced jointly by the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainskaya Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. You can find us on the resources of Ukrainskaya Pravda, as well as on every largest podcast platform, Apple, Google, Spotify, SoundCloud, and others. Don't forget to subscribe to receive updates and join new episodes. Today, we are going to talk about the military tactics and strategies, about battles in cities and towns, about the ability of our soldiers to exceed all expectations of Western military experts, and why the Battle of Kyiv, Mariupol, Azovstal, and other heroic cities and other territories will go down in history. And my guest is a very interesting person, John Spencer, scholar, professor, writer, combat veteran, national security and military policy analyst, and internationally recognized expert and consultant on urban warfare. Welcome.
Thank you.
Can you tell a little bit about how you became an urban warfare specialist?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't had that one in a long time. So when I was still in the Army, so I served 25 years in the U.S. Army. At one point, I served in the Pentagon as an advisor to our Chief of Staff of the Army. So a four-star general, he had stood up a small group, a research group called the Strategic Studies Group. And for a year, we looked at mega cities, which are cities over 10 million. And could the U.S. military, with all its capabilities, all of its size, all of its power, achieve a military mission in a big city like that, so over 10 million? And that was my introduction into studying urban warfare. I had experiences in Iraq and other places in combat in cities, and I knew how hard it was. But that was about 2014. I started studying it academically. I moved to West Point, where I am a research professor now, and stood up a research center called the Modern War Institute, which is, interestingly, there's not that many organizations in the West that study modern war. A lot of people like to study past wars, historians and academics, but really the studying the war in the real time is really hard to do. And really the journalist had owned the kind of space of studying wars in real time for the broader audience. So we stood up this research center. I helped start it, and then I started writing about urban warfare and really identified that there was a major gap. There's really not that many people in the world that study only urban warfare, because everybody likes to study wooded trench warfare, all these other types of mountain warfare, but it's incredible around the world. There's no research centers solely, or soldiers, even in the U.S. military. There's not one person in the U.S. military who only studies fighting in cities.
And you mentioned contemporary warfare, yeah? So before this, like a full invasion, everyone was saying that the time of like a very conventional war has passed. We see that European countries, for example, don't have so many tanks. Half of them were not operating at the moment of invasion. So most of analytics and military personnel were targeted at, hybrid, cyber, and so on. What we faced here, that's very conventional. It looks like, from the Second World War pictures. But at the same time, Ukraine uses a lot of drones, Russia too. Ukraine uses a lot of some kind of modern equipment to control the operational field. So what is contemporary warfare? What's it about?
For real, that's an academic course of many, many lessons. There's always been a camp who study past wars, and there's always been a camp that try to make believe on what they think the future of warfare is, right? The robotics, artificial intelligence, all these things that you don't need anymore. Really, Ukraine has reminded, what I like to tell people is Ukraine has reminded people what matters most in war. It's not who's the biggest. It's not who has the most advanced technologies. It's a combination of a lot of things. But Ukraine is making, unfortunately, although I want the war to end tomorrow, Ukraine is showing the world, to include the U.S. military, the biggest and most powerful in the world, what real contemporary warfare looks like. It is a combination of the old with a combination of the new. It is a combination of all forms of power. Just because you have an ideal big military, the Russian military was never going to, and they realized it too late, defeat Ukraine, because Ukraine is not just Ukraine's military. Ukraine is people. It's industrial capability, it's innovation, it's educated population, and it's will to fight. So no military could have done that. So this is what, contemporary warfare is Ukraine. There are variations. Not all war is the same in different parts of the world, not warfare, but this is why we teach military theory. In Ukraine, you can see all these old theories from Sun Tzu 2,000 plus years ago to Clausewitz, so all these guys that we teach. And those guys, we call them masters of war, the great captains, were teaching this stuff back then, but the world was starting to forget about it. And they use bad examples, right? We use examples of wars where it was over in 96 hours, like the Desert Storm and things like that. And I think personally that Russia had believed all that in themselves and okay, we can do this real fast with a small force, and because it worked here, here, and here. Well, you can't misapply principles onto every situation.
So what is your mission now in Ukraine? What you're doing here?
So I've been coming every 3 to 6 months to do research, like we were just talking about, on modern war. And then I write about it. I do lectures, I have a podcast, I teach all around the world what the lessons I'm gathering from Ukraine's fight for survival, from the national level, strategic, down to the tactical, what's working, what's not, what we have been reminded about, such as artillery and things like that. The world had said, we don't need that anymore. So I come in every time because you can't study war from afar. You really can't. So I come in, I meet with commanders and veterans, and I go to the battlefields, I walk the ground, especially at the Battle of Kyiv. I've spent a lot of time, over a year, studying the Battle of Kyiv so I can take those lessons and apply it around the world.
And what do you think about the Battle of Kyiv?
Well, that's a long one. I'm still learning all the, what we call the fog and the friction of war. But there are ways you take a capital city, and then there's ways you don't take a capital city. But then you have to plan for the contingencies. Russia thought they could do more than they could. And when they faced a problem, they weren't able to adapt for many reasons. The military wasn't able to adapt. And they had been told the wrong things, right? The intelligence about they would be welcomed and all these things. And then they attacked across 7 fronts. But I call Battle of Kyiv, when I present, the most decisive battle of the modern era. And by let's define modern era, since the end of World War II. Because it was the only battle, as I teach battles in West Point, a decisive battle, right? A decisive battle is one that determines the outcomes for both sides, strategic outcomes. Russia in February, in the full-scale invasion, wanted to take Ukraine, wanted to remove the Ukraine's government and its autonomy, wanted to recolonize it back into the Russian Federation. It instead stated that's the strategic goal. Ukraine's strategic goal was to survive as an independent, democratic, self-determination nation. So that one battle, although all the battles mattered, so the Battle of Chernihiv, the Battle of Sumy, the Battle of Mariupol, they all mattered. But the decisive battle was the Battle of Kyiv. So once Russia lost and withdrew, got defeated and surrendered on April 3rd, that was it. The war of Ukraine had been won, although the fighting is going to continue because all of Ukraine is Ukraine. But the fight for Ukraine as a democratic nation, as its own nation in its identity, Russia lost that, and then it changed its goals. That wasn't really what we were doing. We just wanted the Donbass and southern Ukraine.
They changing all the time. But you said one very important point, which is also for me the question, that Russia had wrong perception, misperception, wrong data from intelligence. At the same time, in the beginning, Ukraine, I believe, also made a lot of mistakes, or because we didn't have the data, or because we didn't pay attention to data. And the same mistakes actually were done by all the politicians in the world, from democratic states, because they obviously did have the data from intelligence, but the decisions which were politically made were not relevant to situation. They didn't have plan A, plan B for the invasion. It was just one plan that Russia will come, and then it will be like a small rebels, and then everything will happen. Why you think although you have a lot of, academies, think tanks, centers of study in Russia, why so many mistakes were made at this first point?
Mistakes from within Ukraine, mistakes outside of Ukraine, what we call intelligence assessments. I don't think the world or even Ukraine knew how much Ukraine had changed after the 2014 Maidan Revolution. The government, the military, the police, that there was enough change to tip it towards really reinventing itself. So maybe some of those assumptions about the way that Ukraine would respond to Russia might have applied in 2007. But after the invasion in 2008, 2014, the war against terror, counter-terror mission, I think that there wasn't enough people, intelligence, politicians, all that in Ukraine to understand what is Ukraine. Because this is what we teach, right? It's so hard to study what will happen until you put it to the test. So Russia's military, I used to sit in briefings where Russia's military was getting better than the U.S. in things like long-range artillery and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
All that's on paper until you test it. And this is the Russian military, which is one form of power, was put to the test and was found wanting. It isn't even the second best military in Ukraine anymore, let alone the world. I don't know the answer to why everybody got it wrong. I think, and even me, they didn't know Ukraine. They didn't know Ukrainian people. Even in Ukraine with politicians, right? That all war is politics, but when you actually fight a war for survival, you use best military advice because you start to get into operational capabilities, knowing what to protect, knowing what to prioritize, or the sole objective. And like you said, even the Ukrainians didn't expect Ukraine, even though it's on the border, to attack Kyiv, the capital city. And that was the risk. In the opening days, there was a risk if Kyiv would have fallen. Yes, 100% Ukrainians, we all know this now, would have fought a counterinsurgency for years and would have resisted for years. It matters, but the war for Ukraine would have been lost when a Russian flag was raised on top of the Capitol building.
Did you make a compare of Afghanistan situation and Ukraine? Because I think that Afghanistan results of mission there are influenced very much on perception or prognosing what will happen in Ukraine.
It shouldn't have. I did not compare at all Afghanistan to Ukraine. Even in security assistance and training other militaries, the culture it literally is night and day. And if somebody did that, then we have terms for this, basically. When you don't study or understand in the context of the place where it is, right? Ukraine's history is ancient. I mean, Kyiv predates Russia. It's understanding that tacit awareness of what is Ukraine, what it is to be Ukrainian. I knew not to compare at all Afghanistan to Ukrainians. And this is really this idea and why I studied the Battle of Kyiv too, because it applies. So I wrote a manual. I don't know if you saw it. When the war started, as a civilian, right, with no association, I have to be very clear on that. I wrote a manual to help Ukrainian civilians resist. It's called the Mini Manual for the Urban Defender. And it did great. I was so humbled when I saw territorial defense and civilians looking at the manual and learning what to do to help defend their cities. Because there's very specific urban things that can be done to slow a military down. You can block the streets and do all this. But what's even more interesting is that manual has been translated now into 17 different languages. Because in the world, there is this idea of sovereign nations and nationality, right? I am Ukrainian. I am Polish. I am Lithuanian. This is very important in human nature. But there's an idea of what's called total defense, which means that if another country invades, then everybody will resist. Everybody will defend who they are. And this is what Ukrainians really had to show the world. Unfortunately, believe this as well, is that one of the reasons why Ukraine had to defend itself, because it had to show that it was Ukrainian. The people had to stand up and resist, and they did that in spades from February 24th into today. I mean, it's just amazing. But the rest of the world is watching because there's other countries who are under threat of invasion, unfortunately. Because you have countries like Russia who believe that might makes right and they can do whatever they want because they have nuclear weapons, even though after World War II, we created all these multinational organizations to stop that from ever happening again. So now there's other countries around the world besides Ukraine, although Ukraine is a priority so that history doesn't change in Ukraine, in the world. But there are other countries that want to replicate what Ukraine did, which is resist.
Is it possible that this is also the question which we discuss so many with foreign friends? Is it possible to replicate it, or this is just like a mixture of local traditions, history, which gave the force to defeat Russian or defend ourselves? Can it be some kind of, guidance afterwards?
I think it can. You have to, don't learn just from the successes, learn from the mistakes. And like you said, there were mistakes in Ukraine. There was a lack of preparedness to defend everywhere.
Yeah, we started territorial defense just building up just in few months before,
That's
although
right.
the law was ready like a few years before the full-scale invasion.
And they thought that the Russians would only come from the east, and that's where most of the military was and the priorities. I do think that there's so much that you could replicate that Ukraine has done from when the war started till now. And this is why I'm here, right? I'm trying to collect those little bits of information on what could be replicated. Like if you do want all your civilians to defend, here, if you do want to integrate civilian capacity, because it isn't just fighting that the civilians stood up. Ukrainian citizens stood up and created all kinds of technology, not just the drones, but like the Delta system, the Krepavak system, the Dia system. Some people call it asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare is when you fight in a non-conventional way, right? I don't like these terms like conventional warfare, unconventional warfare, asymmetric warfare. It is warfare. If you fight conventionally, then you're not fighting right. If you fight the way your enemy wants you to fight, then you will lose. But what's unconventional to me and asymmetric to me is how Ukraine has harnessed the power of the people. And it's not just in fighting, but it's in all the educated people, right? Everybody I meet in all these different organizations, well, what did you do before the war? Well, I was an engineer. I was an IT specialist. I was a professor. I was a doctor. And that has the ability to harness that power. It's not just about military. It's about all forms of power.
And what new you saw in this war from the urban warfare? And maybe you will tell like a few words about Mariupol, for example. I know that you met families of Mariupol defenders and discussed with them some issues.
No, I haven't. Well, I have met families, right? I met Katerina, and I'm sorry, I mess up the last name.
Yeah.
Denise, the Azov regiment commander's wife, who has led the family effort, but she has connected me to actually the veterans. So I'm trying to collect the stories from not just the Azov, but from the Marines and everybody else that was there. I actually got hit this morning before walking in here, like how important I think those stories are. And somebody said, well, first a victory, then stories. I'm like, wow, that's not really, you don't understand how war works, right? War is political. Those stories coming out of Mariupol that I'm meeting on this trip, that I met with so many veterans who are trying to recover medically from their captivity and the war crimes of Russia. But those stories getting out to the world in movies and books are so important to Ukraine's victory that people don't understand how war works. War is politics. War is the will of the people, and you're only as strong as your alliances, right? That's, again, what Ukraine has, showed the world. Everybody knows this, right? Sun Tzu said this 2,000 years ago. Your strength is your alliances, and that's what Russia should have been attacking so that Ukraine was alone. But Ukraine is fighting by itself, and it's never asked for anybody to fight for it, but it's just give us the equipment. But it has 50-plus nations as alliances. So influencing the world on what's happening here, right? Having them really understand what is not enough support, or really understand these very human stories, because storytelling is human nature. That's something that I take a lot of pride in being able to take back, not just the tactics, right? You asked me what's new in warfare. Yeah, we can talk about the drones and the way that Ukraine has used them differently, which is the next evolution in what we call the character of warfare, because the character of warfare is always changing. And Ukraine has shown where the use of civilian technologies, not just the drones, but other systems, like I said, like the Delta system, is changing the capabilities that you can generate on the battlefield. You still need the conventional capabilities, and Ukraine hasn't been given nearly enough artillery, tanks, all this stuff to fight the fight that they need to fight. But the change in the character of warfare is the integration of these civilian capabilities. But again, all this is why I'm meeting with the Azov and the Azov Steel veterans and the Mariupol veterans, is to understand that battle, how 3,000 plus fighters were willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater nation. And by doing so, they held down 20 to 40,000 Russians who couldn't go fight somewhere else. It's another historic battle as, to me, as legendary, not just the human story as Thermopylae and the Spartans or the U.S. and Alamo and all there's context to all of that. But for me as a military instructor too, is that you can defend, and sometimes you're defending and holding for more than most people understand. Like, why are you holding Mariupol? Or Bakhmut?
Yeah.
There are many reasons. I'm trying to capture not just what happened, the story, understand what's changing in modern warfare, to include this ability. So, I'm here with you doing a podcast, and I think it's important because our ability to influence and for the world to see war is as important as the fighting itself for me, because that's a change in warfare. Never in war have you been able to watch war live stream.
Absolutely. TikTok is one of the key instruments, yeah.
Yeah, there's a name for this, like TikTok war. This is almost beyond what people ever imagined, thanks to things like, honestly, like low-orbiting civilian satellites, like Starlink, who have given the world the ability to watch, to see war crimes immediately, not hear about them, not filtered, to feel the war, although you had to come here to understand some things. It's a change in modern war for sure.
Okay, and if this is changing, do you see the necessity to change the strategies and concepts of war, for example, in United States doctrines or in NATO doctrines? Because I don't know whether it's true, but I think so, that few months ago, half a year ago, it was like a interview of one of Baltic's leader. She said that in NATO concept, it was like the NATO forces, in case of Russia attacking, should withdraw from Baltics for half a year and then release them back. And everyone was shocked because for half a year from Baltics, there would be no people stayed alive because of Russians. And so that demonstrates that really the many concept doesn't include this understanding of the contemporary warfare. Do you see necessity of change, and what do you think should be changed there?
Absolutely, there's necessity to change. There's lots of people working on it to change it, right? NATO was on the verge of being irrelevant. It was on the verge of going away before Russia's strategic blunders will be taught in schools for generations. By invading Ukraine, it made NATO relevant again. It made Ukraine remember and made the world understand what is Ukraine, from Cossacks to all the way back. Yes, it is changing the strategy. From everything from military capabilities, Ukraine is showing the world what it takes to fight a conventional fight. We've closed down most of these capabilities, and all of NATO all the countries, Western countries, are having to make massive societal changes to understand what it would take to defend yourself, which is deterrence, because you don't want to fight. Every bit of whether the laws of war that manage the strategy, right? All these things are interwoven together. There are such big changes. Now, is it happening fast enough? You can argue that, and I know that the conference talked about some of this. It's a long list, but yeah, NATO's changing, the size of force, the threat that is Russia and other countries to what we call the global international order. And if you want to maintain it, maybe some of the things that were created, like some of these multinational organizations, such as the International Criminal Court and the laws of war, there's so many different changes that have to happen in militaries, in alliances, in laws, in agreements, like in the EU and NATO. They're not my area of expertise, but this war has changed the world, and many people don't understand that. And again, this is about the access to information, wherever the people get their news. And I try to say it when I'm on interviews. You don't understand that this war has already changed the world. This is much more than Ukraine. And if we don't stand for Ukraine, the world will change in a really bad way.
Yeah, that's one of the issues which we discuss now among the experts here, that we try to convince many of our partners through the positive model why you need Ukraine. and why we shall win this war. But I think that we reached some kind of line with this because we used all of the arguments. And we never explained what would be if Ukraine will lose this war, yes, and Russia will win, and what the world will be afterwards. One small question before I come to deterrence. It started some kind of common to use the word terrorism instead of war. For me, it's always, I do understand that it's easily to use it from legal point of view, but what we see, it's war. It's not the terroristic acts. It's just the war. It's killing the people. What do you think about this? Why it became so common?
I think it's the history and heuristics, right? So we teach, and because there have been other people in the past that develop a way to talk about war that make people understand it, that war is not just about militaries fighting each other. War is three populations. It's called the Trinity. It's the people, and that can be the people in the country. That can be the people in the world, in the globe. It's the politicians, which are elected by the people in democratic nations, and their influence of telling what objectives to pursue. And then there's the military. So in this idea of why do we keep saying the war, terrorism, and the use of the word terror, because of the global war on terrorism, it's a heuristic for people to understand evil. And that's what it is. I mean, that's what Russia has done in Ukraine is evil. And they use terror. This war in Ukraine's fight has put everything that we ever said would prevent wars like this from happening again to the test. It's put the ideals of sovereignty, of post-colonialism, recolonization, genocide, taking war to the people, not to the military. All these things that after World War II, we said never again, right? That's the slogan, never again. I think people in trying to understand the war in Ukraine have used terrorism as a heuristic to understand how bad the things that Russia does, and there's no accountability. So yeah, I agree with you that it probably shouldn't be used as much as it is, right? But that's, Russia uses war crimes as a method of warfare. Right? It attacks the people, and we've had uncountable number of air raids just on my visit here, this trip, and wants the people to fear so that they will influence their politicians to change what they're doing and come to some terms. It'll never work. But for the outside audiences, unfortunately, it's a way to try to communicate. And why I think this is so important that organizations like yours just continually try to communicate to the people of Ukraine, to the people of Europe, to the people of the West, and to the people of Russia on understanding what's really happening here, the genocide, the attacking civilians every day. That is using terror as a method. And that's the definition of terrorism, right? You're just trying to instill fear on people so they do something, right? You're trying to coerce them to do something. It is terror, but it is also war, and it's a legal war. There are ways to legally, and now things about, so what? I don't follow the rules. Now what are you going to do is getting put to the test. And that's what Russia wants to test. Like, I don't care. I'll commit genocide. What are you going to do to me? I have a nuclear weapon. And there should be more being done. And this is the test.
Okay, so coming back to deterrence and nuclear weapon, this is the next red line, like, 120 red line in this war.
Right.
Russia actively now used the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant as the blackmailing instrument and usage of tactical nuclear weapons too. In accordance with the polls which are done in Ukraine, more than 86% said that even in the case of use of tactical nuclear weapons, Ukraine shouldn't be ready to go for negotiations. So it's not like we do not afraid, but we do understand that if we lose this war, we lose our nation and our state. So we don't have a choice. Okay, nuclear weapons to nuclear weapons. But still, there is a lot of fears in Western countries. My feeling is that they are more connected to the, let's say, difficulty to make a decision how they will respond than to use of it. But how realistic you think is the nuclear weapons usage in Ukraine? That's first. And the second, nuclear weapons as a deterrence factor didn't work if Russia is here. I mean, they started this war. So what should be a deterrence model?
That's, again, another huge question. We've done deterrence conferences at West Point because there's many angles of that question. First, how likely is it that Russia would use a nuclear weapon, even a tactical nuclear weapon, which is over the last year has taken on its own misconceptions, right? Tactical nuclear weapons was a very likely scenario coming out of World War II, where we didn't want to use a city-destroying tactical nuclear weapon like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were actually like big artillery rounds. We all had them. The Soviets had them. The U.S. had them. And everybody had these smaller tactical or nuclear weapons that they thought they would use on the battlefield to achieve military goals. They weren't meant to be war-ending weapons, but people have used tactical or nuclear weapons to mean different things over the last couple of years. I actually think, so we also teach that trying to understand the goal of Putin or Russia is hard, right? Because who's calling the shots, all these things. When you try to determine what's the political interest of Russia other than just to destroy Ukraine, where is he willing to stop and all this? Putin isn't evil, but I don't think he's irrational. Most people believe it's called rational actor theory. He's rational. And all, dictators and tyrants and across the history of time, their number one interest is survival. Survival as the leader and survival as the political party in charge of their nation and imposing their will on everybody else. If a weapon of mass destruction, it doesn't have to be nuclear, it could be chemical, biological, is used in Ukraine, a rational actor would know that would change everything. And the West has been pretty clear on that. And I actually think the West has clearer plans on what it would do if that happens than it does right now. Then on, the escalation for this weapon, the escalation for that weapon. We don't want to make him mad. We don't want this to happen. It's all in this gray area of political calculation. Nuclear or WMD at all actually would trigger very planned things. For example, if a tactical nuclear weapon was used in Ukraine, our political leadership already said that it would require for national interests of like the United States and the UK of the immediate and destructive response, like destroying the Russian military in Ukraine immediately, destroying the Russian Navy in the Black Sea immediately, overnight. And that's not me and John Spencer talking. I can't say that, but that's our political leaders. And I think there are war plans that it would be an immediate response. Immediate. And that's, again, that is deterrence because we've made it very vocal, right? Even the U.S. senators came out and tried to pass a bill to make it even clearer, but it's actually not necessary. It's a plan. And I know that Russia knows that. And by communicating to that, we're actually trying to talk to also people under Putin. Like, look, if you let whatever crazy scenario that happen, there is no more Putin. There is no more Russian government as it is today. There is no more Russian military like it is today. That's deterrence. When you can change an actor's actions, that for me, you can never say it's not possible. It's just unlikelihood, very unlikely that they would be that stupid and self-defeating like that, because even evil, rational actors want to survive. And that would change everything. And that's the reason that I don't think even a tactical, which is a smaller, very localized, low radiation use, all that weapon would be used because it would cross. And there have been many red lines that have been crossed. And then when you let somebody cross a red line, that's no longer, the deterrence capability fails. Our deterrence failures in Europe started in 2008 with Russia's activities in Georgia, Crimea, in Donbass. Like all those were tests of deterrence and nobody did really anything. So there is a rational path to Putin's action because nobody did anything before. Luckily, this time, once Ukraine showed that it was willing to fight for itself, then the alliances came. It's not enough, but this is deterrence theory, right? That you won't do something because of this or that, even though you have this capability. That's strategic. But I do think that we have to go back to the books. Like you said, what's changing? In our conferences about strategic theory, we are arguing like, look, this country has a nuclear weapon, and we said all these things about sovereignty, right? You cannot invade another nation to take away its sovereignty just because you have a nuclear weapon and they don't, right? And there is a bit of the theory that if a country has a nuclear weapon, they're not invaded, right? And this is the arguments about the Budapest agreements and the security agreements and all of that. if you're not an academic, you don't really have to debate these things, but this war is really testing the global international order that holds all of our countries together. And this is where civilians, because there's millions of them, don't understand. Like when I go to the store and buy things, I have that ability because of this global international order, economically, politically, information, all this. And what Russia is doing in Ukraine is trying to upset it all, to include the use, what is okay in the use in war of weapons. We have strong rules on what you can and can't do in war. But if those rules aren't backed with force, then it's not deterrence, and then you might as well just erase the rule because we're not following it, right? The use of bombing of civilians on purpose is a giant war crime, like one of the top coming out of World War II, like the Dresdens and all, the Blitz on London. Like we said never again, but look, we're letting them do it, and we're not doing anything about it. So just throw the rule away or do something about it.
Okay, let's speak about counteroffensive and Crimea. I receive so many questions now. Do I consider the counteroffensive to be successful, or this is complete lost, or what's that? I have my opinion, but here is about your opinion. As a military, how you can evaluate the counteroffensive and how you can evaluate the possibility for Ukraine to take Crimea back, military.
The first one's a little easier, counteroffensive, based on what we call large-scale combat operations or large-scale wars. Unfortunately, because of these very visible wars and the attention span of humans at this point, they want immediate results, right? We want to see action, reaction really fast. Again, if you don't come to Ukraine, you don't understand how massive it is on the map. You don't understand geography. You don't understand what Russia is trying to take with the force that it has. You don't understand the numbers, and what we call, people hear numbers, they really don't understand what it means, 100,000 soldiers or 50 brigades, or they just see dollar figures and like, $40 billion, that's a lot. That should be enough to win, right? And they don't even understand that that's not even 5% of a single year's of defense budget for us, like the U.S. We spend over $800 billion a year, 1 year, on our military to have that deterrence effect and have that capability. People just don't understand even the sizes of forces that are attacking, that are advancing or not. So you'd have to develop measures of success. And I don't know what Ukraine's are. As a military strategist, I can say, well, one of the measures of success is just terrain held and terrain liberated. And we mentioned right before that, like in Bakhmut, the couple hundred meters, a couple thousand meters that ended up being the outskirts of Bakhmut was the only thing that Russia was able to, on a objective analysis, take in almost a year of fighting. So in the counteroffensive, Ukraine, mobilized what it could with forces, received what it could in Western equipment, and developed this number of assault brigades to conduct the counteroffensive and liberate land. So one of the assessments on how's the counteroffensive going, yes, there are lots of people that wanted immediate results. Like, well, that's not war. Ukraine doesn't fight attrition warfare. It doesn't sacrifice soldiers like Russia does, right? 100,000 dead and wounded to take Bakhmut. Ukraine's not going to fight that way. It cares about its people. And that's, again, the huge difference that needs to be publicized in war, that countries that do that, the Soviet way, to sacrifice 1 million people, and like, that's just a number. And that for those countries that don't care about their citizens. Ukraine's not going to fight like that. But by measures of success, it has the counteroffensive, I believe, has already been successful, period. It has already liberated multiple villages, multiple urban areas, multiple key intersections, some places that haven't been free since before 2014.
Yep.
By a measure of success, it's already been successful. Has it been as successful as it people think it needs to be to maintain Western alliances? That's another measure. Well, this is, how about you slow down and wait and understand warfare, is that Russia did take a year to put out defensive lines, mining, again, committing war crimes, mining areas without knowing even where, they don't even know where they mined. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of meters. I usually, try to say what just the square kilometers of the border area that we're talking about, but people just don't get it. Sometimes you try to like insert Texas and Georgia and try to give people a simile to understand. But Another measurement in counteroffensive is that it hasn't fully deployed, right? Somebody wants to call it a defeat, right? In my opinion, as a strategist, as a military student of warfare, it's already successful. It's already liberated more land than Russia did in a year.
Yeah.
It hasn't yet deployed the majority, even half of the forces that were allocated towards the counteroffensive. So everybody wants to, now. Like, that's not your decision to make. Ukraine will advance when Ukraine knows it is an acceptable amount of risk to Ukrainian soldiers, men and women fighting for survival. It's not going to just waste tens of thousands of lives to achieve happiness from somebody else. So we know that the Ukraine hasn't deployed even half of the brigades allocated for the counteroffensive. So somebody wants to point on the map, everybody wants to hurry up and say, okay, it failed. That's ridiculous. It's already a success. And the true success, where it's ultimately able to achieve in this counteroffensive, is yet to come. What are the true objectives? Nobody knows except Ukrainians. And that's a secret, and I don't want to know.
Good comparison was used by Ben Hodges. Look back at Normandy. We all consider this operation to be successful, but just to remind you timing of this operation. And within this time, like 1 month, they just cannot be landed on the land. They were just trying, making attempts. And if you are within this period, you cannot evaluate this as successful. But looking back, you do understand that they reached the purpose of this operation afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Again, this is modern war. People learning what modern conventional warfare. Nobody's seen it since the 1940s.
Yeah.
So what are you comparing the counteroffensive to? You're trying to compare it to like a 4-day invasion or operation against nothing and evaluate against that as your model of success. But we do have to get better at storytelling and analogies like this. But stop comparing Ukraine to wars that have no similarity to Ukraine, right? Stop comparing it to anything that's happened in the last 50 years.
So Crimea, tell us about your ideas about Crimea and whether it's possible. And do you see some shaping operations, for example, now happening?
There's a lot of variables there. I'm a student of Ukraine as well, understanding the history of Crimea, the history of internationally recognized borders, the history of independence. Not one area of Ukraine is the same as the other. Is it military capable to take back Crimea? Absolutely. Will Russia politically allow that? Well, what can Russia do? Russia has deployed what military it has and struggles to keep its military in Ukraine fed, equipped. It doesn't have some magical other military. Militarily, Ukraine could take Crimea, absolutely. And if it says it will, I believe them. They will. The politics of it is the other interesting question. This is where you try to get into your enemy's head on what will it do. I agree with General Ben Hodges, who is one of the few out there that I know is a student of this and listens and comes and tries to get people to understand. He says, you don't have to, you can put Russia at such a great disadvantage in the Crimea Peninsula, in the area, that they'll have no choice. And this is what people don't understand in a war too, is that that's one of the goals, is to give your enemy a choice. Either leave or die. And what we've seen in this war so far, that Russian soldiers, when given the question of leave or die, they leave. They don't fight like the veterans of Mariupol, who are willing to give everything to be free and for their nation and who they identify as. That's not Russia. That's not Russian soldiers in Ukraine. So I agree with General Hodges that when Ukraine's ready, it can put Crimea with the weapons it already has at such a disadvantage that give them the question, do you want to die or will you leave? But then there's all war is politics. So what is the political problem? All war ends at the table. It is Ukrainian people's, and I've heard President Zelensky say this, and this is of a true leader. It's not up to me how this war ends. It's up to the Ukrainian people. If the Ukrainian people says we will fight for every inch to reestablish the 1991 borders, then I believe they'll fight for every inch. But all war ends at a political negotiating table. That is the definition of war. It is two countries seeking political goals. All war ends at a political table. Ukraine will come at that table at a great position of strength. But will Crimea be the one thing that the other side says, no, this will never end with you on Crimea, with the loss of our naval base with this or that. Hopefully Ukraine continues to gather strength where it won't matter what the other side wants. Crimea is both a very big tactical question based on military capabilities, but a more so than other questions, a very strategic question on what will Russia do. I mean, hopefully Ukraine continues to be able to make it. It doesn't matter what you want to do, and this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's actually what Zelensky said.
Yeah.
I don't
really?
care.
Really?
I don't care what advices someone will give me.
Yep.
I know that we will release Crimea, and I won't listen to someone about other opinions. And I think that this is a really unique situation when a really nation dictates the conditions of these negotiations, and Ukrainians are quite united about their position. Okay, so we are coming to the end. I have few more questions. Prognosis of ending the war. That's also one of the most questions asked to me, for example, among friends, among journalists, everyone. What prognosis do you have?
Yeah, I get that a lot too. And just being a student of war is that anybody who tells you they can predict what's going to happen, you should not listen to, because nobody can. That's war. War is human, so you can't predict. Putin could fall tomorrow. Nobody would have saw that. Nobody would have saw Wagner doing a coup in Russia. Nobody would have predicted that. So anybody who says they can predict how this war ends is wrong. I can say the likely end of the war, and then of course your question will be when, is that the Russian military will culminate. That's the term we teach. And by culminate, it means it no longer has the capability to do its assigned mission, right? So Russia's military mission right now is to defend what they have illegally taken so far. They're occupying. Well, in many areas, Ukraine is showing that Russian military doesn't have that capability to hold that. This is, again, going back to the counteroffensive. It's just a small example, but the war ends when Russia's military can no longer do what it's trying to do, and it culminates in Ukraine, which will push the leaders to come to the negotiation table. And by negotiating table means listen to Ukraine's terms, get out of Ukraine. When does that happen? Well, it's not happened so far because the West hasn't given Ukraine what it needs. And I mean, not even a fraction of what it needs to do that mission, to make Russian military culminate. We gave 30 tanks, or in the beginning, it was 4 pieces of artillery. Like, we know what it takes to do that, to make Russian military culminate, and why won't you give it is the question. I don't know why. That's a very political, complex question. But war is a little easier than politics. I'm saying it will end with Russian military culminating. It doesn't have the military to fight the fight it's trying to fight right now. And Ukraine, unfortunately, although it loses soldiers every day, and that's horrible, the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian society actually gets stronger every day. So the military is growing in size, and it's growing in capability, and it's growing in experience. So it's just a clock ticking against Russia. The longer it tries to do what it's doing, the faster it will be defeated. So everybody wants to know how it ends. For me, easy. It ends with military culmination. And Putin can want all the things at once, but it doesn't have the military to do that, then you don't get that. When does that happen, though? Well, a lot of that relies on other people in Ukraine. The counteroffensive is happening, but it's happening with what you fight with the military you have. It's happening with the equipment that it has. This is why people are more comfortable talking about weapons than they are other things like training and everything else. I used to say that this war goes on, the conflict goes on for months, not years. Whereas other people say 2 years. Other people say multiple years. I personally, my gut feeling, again, this is why predictions are so hard, is that the Russian military doesn't have years. It doesn't have the capability to, and some sanctions do work. And there should be many, many more than there already are, right? Because in war, it is politics. So it's not just about military power, it's about economic power. How much longer can Russia destroy the Russian economy before it actually feels it? That's happening, but it's not happening fast enough. It all could be sped up. It all could be, and that has nothing to do with Ukraine's counteroffensive. The end of this war could be sped up by other people, and it should be. I'm a firm believer. I still believe, although I have many concerns, that the fighting can go for months, but the war can't go for years. Now, that doesn't mean that Putin will ever stop wanting to destroy Ukraine. And there will probably always be the threat of violence along the border. I don't know what the end looks like, the separation between Ukraine and Russia. Hopefully a demilitarized zone between the two where no weapons are allowed, no military force are allowed. There are ways to do this, but Putin has to give up on its evil, tyrannical interests. And you do that by making this military culminate to where it doesn't matter what you want. You don't have a military to do that. I think General Hodges has said it a few times. It could end by Christmas. Could, but there's a lot of variables in could.
I'm here with the General Hodges absolutely on the same position, and so with you, and I hope. And then this is not the hope. This is some kind of logical constructions which demonstrate that we could get it.
You understand, and there is a danger, war weariness, right? Ukraine needs to maintain the alliances, and unfortunately, but I understand war, all the interest. And that's why, like I said, the stories to me are so important because I understand storytelling. When you go back to all these different countries, not just the United States, all of these different countries, they need these stories of resistance, will to fight, sacrifice, suffering, even of the military, but also the population. And I've been on all the news channels. Like when Ukraine's not the number one story every day, that's hurting Ukraine. So we have to keep telling the stories. We have to keep having leaders and politicians visit and be shown the resistance. You don't want people forgetting and then the support decreasing. We need the support to increase, to end it faster. So the global tax that Putin is putting on all of us, the world, and Ukraine is the ones dying for it, stops.
Do you think that it could be substantial changes in case of power change in United States?
Yeah, this is the concern, right? The election, right? I do think that could, and this is why if I was any of these leadership positions, not this United States, I don't speak for anybody but myself, I would have a sense of urgency to help Ukraine achieve its victory before that massive political change, which could go, unfortunately, in different directions, which would change the support, it would change all wars politics, could change. Although we have bipartisan support. Again, predicting the U.S. political elections and things like that is a really bad business.
The good point is that in Ukraine, you also can never predict the elections.
Okay. We have bipartisan support. I don't think that will change. But leadership, if it changes and it goes in a different direction, there's a sense of urgency. And if it was me, recognize that sense of urgency and then support Ukraine more than we are today.
Okay, so the last question, probably coming back to your advices to civilian. Before this full-scale invasion, I bought the course from my ex-colleague. He was in advertising business, but in 2014, he joined Front Volunteers and became a military. And he made a course how to survive for civilians in urban fighting. And I just distributed among my colleagues, family. My sister said, I don't believe that it could happen in reality. I also said to her that with high probability it won't happen, such a massive urban fighting, but still we need to be prepared. I was wrong with this. It happened. So what are your advices now for civilians who are still staying in Ukraine with all these massive attacks, with still potential fighting on the streets, and what's the best model for them to use?
Preparedness is the ultimate form of deterrence. Is when you know that you yourself are prepared for whatever it is, whatever emergency, whether it's air raids or full war. Preparedness is the ultimate form of deterrence to prevent it from happening, to where it won't have the impact that your enemy wants. So for the civilians, they don't need advice from me at this point. And that's why my manual is kind of, it's helping other people now around the world. Ukrainians know that they must be ready for Russian military anywhere. And that's why you see not even the territorial defense, which we agreed wasn't ideal in the beginning, which really wasn't together. Now it's something very massive and powerful. But as I go out and visit villages and communities, high schools, need to keep up that amount of preparedness. And the community defenders that I meet that aren't territorial defense, but they're actually community defenders, have formed these groups because planning and preparedness, learning these skills of medical aid, learning these skills of what we will do without instructions. And that was actually the resistance in the beginning. Nobody told anybody what to do. They went out and fought because they wanted to be free. But that level of instructions, and usually the schools are a really great way of doing, whether it's to stay away from bombs and UXO identification, because that's unfortunately the Ukraine's future as well as the demining, and that people will die for years to come. That level of national standardization of what people know about medical care, bomb identification, and ultimately the defenders, as in the community defenders, understanding if this ever happens again, we'll be more prepared than we were last time. We'll know what to do differently. We'll do what worked. This time we'll plan for it. Because some of the victories that were achieved were luck. Because people wanted to do good things, but you had to harness that power. So I think the advice to everybody's community is, that's why I come here. People will come to Ukraine to learn what they did right, what they did wrong. Even within Ukraine, the civilians need to understand and prepare themselves, use those things that worked, whether that's medical aid, preparing supplies, and everything that wasn't done, or knowing what the plan is for that area. All these things, I'm hoping the Ukrainian civilians are thinking through, so that the next time there's less fear. Because that's when you don't prepare, then you're scared. And there were large groups of people that didn't know what to do and were scared. And I'm hoping that there's some type of institutionalization of that process, so that there's less fear, less impact, less terror. Although that's what it is. What would happen if this happened again?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The conversation was very interesting. When we will switch off the microphones, I will ask you how to get on your course because it's really, really interesting. And I hope you will come back again and we will discuss some other issues or lessons learned which you got from Ukrainian war. Thank you for what you're doing here. Just to remind you that it was podcast Safe and Safe Country, and my name is Alina Frolova. This podcast is a joint project of the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine, and you can find us on the resources of Ukrpravda, as well on other largest podcast platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, and SoundCloud. Safe and Safe Country podcast. All of us can influence on how soon the word unsafe will disappear.